Okay, so you want to own the Red Bull company. Sell a can of caffeinated sugar water, sponsor some extreme sports, watch the cash roll in from every gas station and nightclub on Earth. Here's the problem. The company that gives you wings does not own a single factory that makes the drink inside the can. It costs roughly 9 cents to produce. It sells to you for up to $3.59. And the two families who actually own this company have spent the last 3 years locked in a quiet power struggle that recently ended with one of the most famous team bosses in motorsport getting fired. Hold on to that gap. 9 cents to make, $3.59 to sell. By the end of this video, that gap is going to explain almost the entire business. Before making this video, I went through Red Bull's own published sales figures, Austrian corporate registry filings on its ownership structure, and reporting on the internal fight that followed the death of its founder. So everything in this video is based on real research, not guesswork, and by the end of it, you'll understand why Red Bull spends more of its revenue on marketing than almost any beverage company on Earth, why the company technically owns 0 can-filling factories, despite selling nearly 14 billion cans a year, why the company carries no financial debt while spending billions on Formula 1 and extreme sports, why a quiet 2% ownership transfer in 2025 may have decided who really runs a multi-billion euro company, and the one number, a simple percentage, that explains why this business defies almost everything you'd expect from a company that sells a commodity drink. To understand any of that, you first need to see what you're actually buying when you buy a can of Red Bull. And it isn't the drink. Let's start with the number that should make no sense. Red Bull sold 13.969 billion cans worldwide in 2025, generating a record 12.196 billion in revenue, up 8.6% from the year before, according to the company's own reported figures. That's roughly 14 billion individual purchase decisions in a single year. Producing a single can, the syrup, the aluminum, the packaging, cost the company an estimated 9 cents. In Western markets, that same can sells wholesale for around $1.87 and retails to you for as much as $3.59. Notice something else about that can while you're at it. It's smaller than almost every other energy drink on the shelf. Red Bull has deliberately stuck with an 4-ounce can for decades, while rivals like Monster sell larger, cheaper cans through wider distribution networks. That's not an oversight. A smaller can at a higher price reinforces the exact premium positioning. The rest of this video is about to explain because the size of the can was never really about how much liquid you get. Somewhere between that 9-cent cost and that $3.59 price sits almost the entire logic of this business, and it has almost nothing to do with what's actually in the can. Here's the part nobody tells you. Red Bull does not own a single can-filling factory. When Dietrich Mateschitz built this company in the late 1980s, he made a decision that still defines the business today. He outsourced 100% of physical manufacturing to Rauch, an Austrian bottling company, and never built factories of his own. That single decision freed up an enormous amount of capital that a normal beverage company would have spent on production infrastructure, and Mateschitz poured almost all of it into something else entirely. The company that gives you wings does not own a single factory that makes the drink inside the can. It never has, and it never needed to. So where did that capital actually go? This is the mechanism that explains everything else about how this business works, and it's a term worth understanding properly. Brand equity monetization through owned media rather than rented advertising. Most companies buy advertising space inside someone else's content. Red Bull builds the content itself and owns it outright. Red Bull Media House produces documentaries, a monthly print and digital magazine called The Red Bulletin with a circulation in the millions, and Red Bull TV, a free global streaming platform for extreme sports and live events. That division doesn't just spend money, it licenses its content back out to networks and earns revenue of its own. Think of it like the difference between renting a billboard for a weekend and building your own television network that other companies eventually pay to broadcast on. A rival energy drink brand can sponsor a single race. Red Bull can sponsor the race, film it with its own production crew, broadcast it on its own platform, and put the winning team on its own payroll. Because it owns an actual Formula 1 team, Red Bull Racing, along with ownership stakes in professional soccer clubs across multiple countries. The widely cited industry estimate is that Red Bull reinvests somewhere between 25 and 35% of its revenue into marketing, sports, and media, compared to roughly 9% for Coca-Cola and 7% for Pepsi. On over 12 billion euros in annual revenue, that's a marketing budget in the multi-billion euro range, more than 3 times what its biggest rivals spend as a share of sales, on a product that costs 9 cents to make. The clearest illustration of how this pays off happened in 2012. Red Bull spent an estimated $50 million sponsoring Felix Baumgartner's Jump from the Edge of Space, a stratospheric skydive livestream to millions of people around the world. Industry estimates place the value of the global media coverage that single event generated at around $6 billion. That's not a typo. A $50 million spend, an estimated $6 billion in earned attention. No traditional advertising campaign in the history of the beverage industry has come close to that kind of return, and it only works because Red Bull owns its own media distribution instead of renting someone else's. The compounding effect of 3 decades of that same strategy shows up in the company's brand valuation. According to Brand Finance, Red Bull's brand value climbed 11% to 8.7 billion euros in 2025, making it Austria's most valuable brand by a wide margin, an asset that exists almost entirely on paper, built from owned content and owned sponsorships rather than factories, patents, or inventory. But 2 forces are working against this business model today, and both of them sit underneath the surface of those record sales numbers. The first is competitive saturation, and the numbers are stranger than they first appear. Globally, Red Bull holds roughly 43% of the energy drink market, with Monster Beverage, which Coca-Cola holds a strategic stake in, at around 39%. Together, those 2 companies control over 80% of the entire global category, an unusually concentrated market even by the standards of consumer goods. But flip to the United States specifically, and the ranking reverses. Monster leads the US market at roughly 35%, edging out Red Bull's 32%, largely because Monster sells in larger, cheaper cans through Coca-Cola's bottling network, while Red Bull has stuck with its smaller, more expensive 8.4-ounce can as a deliberate premium positioning choice. Sitting behind both of them is Celsius, which grew from under $100 million in US sales in 2019 to roughly $2.5 billion by 2025, an 86% jump in a single recent year, built on health-conscious branding aimed at a slightly different customer than Red Bull's extreme sports audience. The category itself is still growing rapidly, with the global market valued at over $106 billion in 2025, but growth invites competitors, and Red Bull's entire moat depends on outspending them on media and sponsorship every single year indefinitely with no finish line. There's a second detail buried in Red Bull's financial structure that makes this entire strategy possible. The company carries no financial debt at all. According to fundamental analysis of the private company's disclosed figures, Red Bull operates on an equity-only capital structure, funding its growth, its media empire, and its sports teams entirely out of its own operating cash flow rather than borrowed money. That's unusual for a consumer goods business selling nearly 14 billion units a year. It means the multi-billion euro marketing budget isn't leverage that has to be paid back with interest regardless of how the year goes, the way it would be for a company that borrowed to fund the same spending. It's discretionary spending out of a cash-generating machine, which is part of why the company can keep increasing that budget year after year without the kind of balance sheet stress that sank companies like AMC or Washington Mutual when their bets on the future didn't pay off fast enough. Red Bull Racing, the Formula One team at the center of that spending, reported its own turnover of more than 307 million British pounds in a recent season on its own, a business large enough to stand on its own financial legs even before counting what it generates in global brand exposure for the parent company. The second force is quieter and more structural, and it goes back to who actually controls this company. Red Bull GmbH has never been owned by a single founder the way people often assume. Since its founding in 1987, ownership has been split almost exactly down the middle between 2 families who never fully merged their operations. Dietrich Mateschitz's side in Austria and the Yovidya family in Thailand, descendants of Chaleo Yovidya, the man who actually invented the original formula called krading dyeing decades before Red Bull existed as a global brand. The origin story itself is worth understanding because it explains why the ownership split exists at all. Mateschitz was an Austrian marketing executive who encountered krading dyeing on a business trip to Bangkok in the early 1980s and found it cured his jet lag. Rather than simply licensing the formula, he proposed a genuine partnership. Chaleo would contribute the formula and the manufacturing knowledge he'd spent decades building as a Thai pharmaceutical entrepreneur, while Mateschitz would adapt the taste and branding for Western markets and run the global marketing machine. Each side put up $500,000 to start the company in 1987. For nearly its entire history, the ownership sat at 49% for Mateschitz, 49% for the elder Yovidya, and 2% for his son Chalerm, giving the Thai side a 51% controlling majority that most of the public never thought about while drinking the can. Which brings us to what happens when that quiet 51-49 balance actually gets tested. Dietrich Mateschitz died in October 2022 at age 78, and his 49% stake passed to his son, Mark Mateschitz, who was 30 years old at the time. Unlike his father, who had run the company's operations personally and publicly for over 3 decades, Mark stepped back from day-to-day operations and took a lower-profile shareholder role, letting a newly formed executive structure of professional managers run the company while he oversaw the family's investment from a distance. On the Thai side, the Yovidya family had never depended solely on Red Bull either. Chalerm Yovidya, who inherited control of the family's stake after his father, Chalio, passed away in 2012, had spent decades building an entirely separate business empire, including Siam Winery, which grew into one of Southeast Asia's largest wine companies, along with healthcare and real estate holdings, meaning the Thai family's wealth was never dependent on any single can of the drink his father originally invented. For a while, the 51-49 balance of power held steady, just as it had for over 3 decades. Then, on May 31st of 2025, a filing quietly appeared in the Austrian Commercial Register. Chalerm Yovidya, the head of the Thai side, had transferred his personal 2% stake in Red Bull GmbH to a Swiss trust company called Fides Trustees. On paper, that transfer meant the Yovidya family's ownership dropped to exactly 49%, precisely equal to the Mateschitz side, ending the Thai family's outright majority for the first time in the company's entire history. 5 weeks later, Christian Horner, the team principal who had run Red Bull's Formula One racing operation for nearly 2 decades and helped build it into a championship-winning team, was removed from his position. Reporting on the internal politics of the company noted that Horner had reportedly maintained close support from the Yovidya side of the ownership structure, and some analysts speculated that the loss of Chalerm Yovidya's personal voting stake may have removed a layer of protection Horner had relied on. It's worth being precise about what is confirmed and what isn't here. The ownership filing and the timing of Horner's removal are both matters of public record, but the exact causal link between the two has never been officially confirmed by the company itself. What later reporting did suggest is that the 2% stake may still be managed under a mandate on behalf of the Yovidya family, meaning the Thai side could still effectively hold a working 51% majority even though the public filing shows an even 49-49 split. If that's accurate, the visible balance of power changed on paper, while the real balance of power may not have changed much at all. Either way, the episode is a real-world lesson underneath every closely held family business at this scale. A 2% line item in a corporate registry filing, something that would look like a rounding error on a spreadsheet, was enough to trigger public speculation about a shift in control at a company generating over 12 billion euros a year, and enough, at minimum, to coincide with the ouster of one of the most recognizable executives in the entire sport of Formula One. So what does this actually look like on a real balance sheet, and where does that 1% I promised you at the start finally come in? It's the marketing spend ratio, the share of revenue a company chooses to reinvest into brand and media rather than take as pure profit or plow into production capacity. And it's the single number that separates Red Bull's economics from every other beverage company on the shelf next to it. Let's run 2 versions of this business and watch what that ratio does to each one. Option 1, imagine Red Bull ran itself like a conventional beverage company, spending roughly 9% of revenue on marketing in line with Coca-Cola. On 2025's actual $12.196 billion in revenue, using the industry standard 37.5% gross margin Red Bull is estimated to maintain, gross profit would land around 4.57 billion euros. After a conventional 9% marketing spend, that leaves roughly 3.5 billion yen before other operating costs, a healthy number, but a boring one, indistinguishable from any other large soft drink company competing purely on shelf space and price promotions. Option 2 is the business that actually exists. Red Bull spends an estimated 25 to 35% of revenue on marketing, media, and sports, somewhere between 3 billion and 4. 3 billion a year, deliberately eating into that same gross profit far more aggressively than any direct competitor. The company's own reported figures show that despite that enormous reinvestment, operating profit still reached an all-time high in 2025, alongside record sales volume growth of over 10%, the strongest in 3 years. For comparison, Monster Beverage, Red Bull's closest global rival, reported $8.3 billion in net sales for the same year, meaning Red Bull's real-world revenue is nearly double that of the next largest branded competitor on Earth, without the benefit of Coca-Cola's bottling network behind it. Spending 3 to 4 times more of its revenue on marketing than Coca-Cola or Pepsi didn't shrink Red Bull's profitability. It appears to be compounding it because that spending isn't rented advertising that disappears the moment the campaign ends. It's owned media, owned teams, and owned events that keep generating attention and reach for years, which is exactly why the company that gives you wings can afford to give away 9-cent syrup for cans that keep selling in record numbers every single year. So here's the ownership verdict on the Red Bull company. Capital intensity. 4 out of 10, since the company famously doesn't own the factories that make its own product and operates on a debt-free, equity-only capital structure, keeping physical capital requirements unusually low for a beverage business selling nearly 14 billion units a year. Regulatory and legal risk. 5 out of 10, moderate for a global consumer beverage company, though the internal ownership structure between two families adds a layer of governance risk most public companies don't carry, and the Horner episode shows that risk isn't purely theoretical. Margin stability. 8 out of 10, because once the marketing and media machine is built and running, the underlying unit economics on a 9-cent can are remarkably forgiving, and the company has posted record operating profit even while increasing its own spending. Structural moat. 9 out of 10, because as the Baumgartner space jump, the 8.7 billion yuan brand valuation, and the Formula One ownership all show, this isn't a moat a competitor can copy by simply spending more money. It's decades of owned media infrastructure that a rival like Monster or Celsius would have to rebuild from scratch, starting from zero. Overall ownership verdict. 8 out of 10. You're not really in the business of selling an energy drink. You're in the business of owning attention at a scale almost nobody else in the beverage industry is willing to fund, and the can just happens to be how they collect the receipt. Somewhere in Fuschel MC, Austria, two families still split a company nearly down the middle over a formula one of them didn't even invent, and the gap between 9 cents and $3.59 is still doing all the heavy lifting. And if your bank account is at zero, don't panic. You're not alone. Most of the internet is watching this exact same video for the exact same reason.